The incidents at Wilfrid Laurier University have certainly provoked a debate within academia and beyond on finding that sweet spot between freedom of expression and respecting the diversity of the student body. Is it possible to satisfy both of those legitimate aims? Let's find out. Can we welcome, in alphabetical order, Shannon Day, Professor of Philosophy, University of Waterloo; Emmett McFarlane, Professor of Political Science, University of Waterloo; Thomas Merritt, Canada Research Chair in Genomics and Bioinformatics at Laurentian University in Sudbury; Janice Stein, Founding Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto; and Ronaldo Walcott, Associate Professor in Social Justice Education at OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. It's good to have all of you here. Thank you for flying in from Sudbury this morning. Great to have everybody, and thank you too, I guess, for braving the traffic on the 401. And thank you for coming 4 subway stops north, Janice. That was great. And Ronaldo. I want to start, actually, Janice, with you because, and I'll put this gently, you have the most teaching experience, I suspect, around this table.
Way to put that.
A nice way to put it. How have you seen this issue of respecting the need for free expression on campus with the need to create safe spaces, take into account everything about a student's ability to learn over your time in teaching?
There's certainly a change. And in some ways, it's a very good change, and in some ways, it's not.
What's the good part?
So the good part is that there's an explicit recognition, and here's the good part. Certainly in the university in which I work, that freedom of speech is the defining value for the university. It's what we're about, and it's core. But that we, at the same time, need to understand diverse perspectives and respect diverse perspectives in that debate.
Is that the bad part?
That's a good thing.
That's all.
And that's
we're still
right.
in the good part here.
We're still in the good part.
So what's the bad part?
The bad part is that I think and this doesn't have to do with diversity. I think it's an independent factor, actually. The bad part is that we have gone too far in limiting the debate if the debate is upsetting to people. And that's where some of the excesses in all of this have happened. So if some faculty, and the university does not ask for this, this is part of a larger social movement, it's part of no university policy. I think that's very important for people to understand. And most of the university, most of the time, most of the day, we are engaged in free and open debate about issues. There are parts at times where a faculty member will say, I'm going to warn you, I'm teaching a book in which there is violent sexual assault, and if that upsets you, you can leave the classroom. That's probably not a good thing.
To leave the classroom?
Right.
And to give that warning?
Even to give the warning, because most faculty members who are in touch with their students have a feel for the class, understand the context, and what we're really trying to do in university is have an open discussion which creates more resilient people. So then when they have to engage with these issues beyond the university, when they leave, feel confident and equipped to do that.
Okay, lots to unpack there, so let's start doing that. Shannon, let me go to you next. As we look for this sweet spot, as the pendulum swings between erring on more free speech or erring in whatever word we should use here, protecting the individual needs of students more, where are you?
I want to shift the discussion from freedom of expression to academic freedom. I think that a lot of the strong responses we've seen in the media have been because of the conflation of those two terms. And I think that while freedom of expression at university campuses is important, I think it's academic freedom in particular that is tied to the mission of the university. And that mission is scholarship, whether it takes the form of research, teaching, or service. And so academic freedom is the freedom to engage in research, teaching, and service as scholars, right? And the reason that I want to shift it to academic freedom is because that means that you're focusing in on particular kinds of research, teaching, and learning outcomes. And there has been far too little discussion throughout this debate of what the outcomes are. So I suspect that Professor Stein and I teach in a very different way. I teach in not only philosophy, but gender studies. And I take real pains at the beginning of the class and throughout the term to try to cultivate a learning environment in which some of the people who have been historically less able to participate in that environment feel well supported, right?
Let me understand what that means.
Yeah,
Does that mean, using the example she just did, that you will give, quote unquote, a trigger warning to students that We're about to deal with something very heavy here. If you can't handle it, you can leave.
Well, I don't use the word trigger warning because that's something that's associated
right
with PTSD.
language
I say I'll occasionally give a caution. Right, I'll give students a caution occasionally about the content.
You ever had anybody walk out?
No. No, I mean, one of the reasons that we give students a caution about the content that we'll be facing is so they can prepare themselves, so they're better able to participate, right? If I suddenly shock somebody with, for instance, to use Professor Stein's example of violent sexual imagery in the content, then they don't have a chance to kind of steady themselves and be ready to process it, right? And so giving them the warning makes it easier for them to stay and participate, and makes it easier in particular for people at the intersection of various kinds of historic oppression to stay and participate. And all of that is part of my academic freedom, right?
Thomas, where are you coming from on this?
From a very different perspective. So I teach genetics, I teach genomics, bioinformatics. The content is very different, but I think one of the points that you brought up is how do you engage people in those conversations? And one of the things that we do an atrocious job with in science, technology, education, and math is diversity, just broadly. And sort of I am the epitome of the problem with STEM, right? So I'm a straight, able-bodied white guy, and there are lots of us in science. So how do we improve that diversity? And part of that is how do you get people to speak up in class and actually have a voice and have a discussion? And then as a professor, how do I promote that at a genetics class, which is not necessarily, traditionally an area for discussion? And I think it's one of the things that we're learning how to do over the last 10 years, 20 years. How do you start those conversations? How do you engage people? And then as an individual, how do I, as somebody who does not embody diversity, do a better job of being an ally and try to support that and grow that in the classroom? And part of that is just starting those conversations.
Can I actually do a follow-up here that is not designed to embarrass you, but I've sat through your classes before, so I know how you teach. And while you don't, obviously, in the field of your study, deal with issues that these two would, your stuff is a little more technical, but you do drop the odd F-bomb, and you are a dramatic performer in class. Have any students expressed any discomfort to you because of that?
They haven't. I am conscious of the fact that at some point I will offend somebody. And I think that at that point I will have to figure out how to really graciously and appropriately apologize. And that's part of the game. In the sciences, I think that there are ways to engage students. And genomics is actually a really engaging field, and it's a pretty easy thing to get people excited about the genetics of you and the genetics of us. But if you present that as an exciting field, that's different than if you're just listing things out of a textbook.
When you offend somebody, are you offending somebody with the content, with the material that you're... So let's distinguish that.
So that's an interesting point.
That's a really important distinction. And the risk comes if you're worried about offending somebody with the content of what you're teaching about
as opposed to the style of his teaching.
As opposed to style. There's no excuse for offending somebody in style, right? That's just rude, frankly. So we're going to take that one off the table. The challenging issue is, do you offend somebody by the content of what
and so I think that I could possibly. So, one of the things I was thinking about as we were sort of thinking about this discussion, I teach science, and I teach from my perspective as a scientist, and I teach from my history of what I understand in science. I try to be very upfront with the students that this is a guess, it's our best guess, it's an educated guess, the textbook is a guess. We're going to be fundamentally wrong, we are wrong. And so I try to give examples of how we have been really wrong in genetics over the last 150 years of genetics to open the door up for us being wrong now. And so I say to the students, your job as new geneticists or scientists is to find the areas where I am as wrong now as the examples that I've given you. That said, I'm sure that there are things, reasonably sure that there are things that I'm saying that somebody could take offense to. And so if you come into my class with a literal religious background in one field or another, and I say to you, this is not a creation story, this is how we think life on this planet has evolved, at some point somebody will be offended by that.
Has that ever happened in your class?
And not in Canada, but I was a student in South Carolina. And as a PhD student, there were more issues in the southeast of the U.S. with what we were teaching and whether it was appropriate.
Now,
okay, hang on a second. Hang on, Janice. I got to get these other guys in. They haven't said a thing yet. Okay, Ronaldo, come on in here and tell us what your view is on how the pendulum, as Janice suggests, has swung too far to the let's protect students from as opposed to let's let free speech bloom.
Okay, so a couple of things. One is that I take the long view on this. So what we're actually seeing today in 2017 is a long cultural war that has been waged in the university. In the 60s, when women's studies, and I happen to be the director of women's studies at the same university as Janice, when women's studies and black studies broke into the North American university, there's been a consistent push against them from the 60s until the present. And part of this debate around free speech, around academic freedom, are ways to diminish the fundamental impact that women's studies and black studies and other ethnic studies has had on the university, all the way up to having women as presidents and women as vice presidents in our institutions. I teach difficult material all the time. My students, I don't have to give trigger warnings. I don't have to do any of that. It's not about what's in our books that's at stake here. It's about a reframing of the university where people like myself, indigenous people, queer people, are making a demand on an institution that had hitherto previously locked us out. And we're saying that our voices matter too. And we're saying that the ways in which the languages of academic freedom and free speech have been framed within the context of the university has often provided pathways, in particular for straight white men, to say really cruel, harmful, hurtful things, and words do hurt. And now we're responding to that, and we're saying, no, this can't happen. This cannot happen in our workplaces where we come to study and so on. This is a cultural war that's being waged within a particular institution, and we should be extremely clear about that. This is a pushback against the ways in which academic scholarship has actually revealed the underpinnings of the university as a kind of white supremacist logic.
Emmett?
I think I agree with most of what's been said in terms of, I teach courses that on the intersection of rights and public policy. We talk about abortion, assisted dying, reasonable accommodation. We talk about the issue that got this TA at Laurier in hot water. I've never had a student complain. I've never had to encourage a student to leave a classroom. I think we underestimate students.
How diverse is your classroom?
At Waterloo, it's actually incredibly diverse. In fact, I often have classes where white students are the minority. And so I haven't experienced any issue like that. I think a large part of the story is how do we in universities respond when students do complain about being offended? And I think there is a tendency to ignore almost everything that's been said already by some university administrators and fly into PR mode, damage control. So a student's offended, we have to act. And we see the type of overreaction that we saw at Laurier happen, and it's not constructive. It doesn't address what Ronaldo said. It doesn't address what any of us has said.
Our senior administrators jump into PR mode, not to address what's happening inside the university, but to quell the shouting voices, largely of the right wing, outside the university. I see this every day at my university, the University of Toronto, with the ongoing Jordan Peterson matter, right? The response has not been to say, women's studies, black studies, African studies, these kinds of studies have been tremendous contributions to the university. Instead, there's been a profound silence, as though the work that folks who work in those areas do does not matter to the overall wealth and generative intellectual sphere of the university. And that is their fundamental flaw, that where we've seen our senior administrators become managers in favor of the donors, in favor of a scared right-wing mob. You never see the so-called left actually getting that kind of response from university administrators.
Yeah, I actually don't agree with you, Ronaldo, on that. I think it's much more subtle and it's much more complex. Actually, the role of university administrators is not to get into those debates. What really matters is that all the programs you talked about, which are very important and from my perspective, a core part of the university, thrive, and faculty members and students feel free to come into the classroom and have these debates. The role of university administrators, fundamentally beyond everything else, and many of them are scholars in their own right, but their role in their current jobs is to protect those rights.
But what I'm saying to you, Janice, is that often their silence is an abrogation of those rights. By their very silence, what they're saying is that some voices matter more than others within the context of the institution.
I don't think that's true.
Well, we fundamentally disagree on that.
Let's look at what the University of Toronto, one concrete example, did when Jordan Peterson's work became very controversial. They did what a university should do. They organized a debate.
They organized a debate that was fundamentally flawed. And Jordan Peterson, it was not even the question of Jordan Peterson's work, because he doesn't work in the areas that he's claiming to criticize. He has no expertise in them. If I, as a black faculty at the University of Toronto, had engaged in the kinds of things that Jordan Peterson engaged in, I am sure I would have been drummed out of the university
Shannon,
by now.
Can I ask you to address this? Are students entitled not to be offended in your class?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me about that, because every time I hear the word offended, I twitch a little bit, because I think that the rhetorical move of talking about offended students wrongly implies that there's something sort of subjective and capricious going on, rather than, again, shifting the discussion to pedagogical design and to scholarship and to how we design spaces so that lots of folks can participate. And if I've been the recipient of a lifetime of abuse and micro inequities because of my embodiment, my racialization, or my gender identity or something, then it's harder for me to participate in a classroom that constructs this notion of two sides that are equally just.
But I'm not asking whether your students are entitled to be free from abuse. Of course they are. Are they entitled to be free from offense?
But my worry is that when we talk about offense, rather than talking about the harms that some students can suffer in a poorly designed learning environment, that we make it seem like the students are capricious snowflakes, rather than focusing on the responsibilities of educators to try to design learning environments that are truly inclusive.
Emmett, follow up.
I think there's an extent to which we're falsely putting values of free expression and academic freedom and the other values of protecting students and protecting particular disciplines. I think there are ways universities could be more supportive of Black studies and women's studies programs without impairing what can be discussed in the classroom. And I think that's part of the, and I do worry about the erosion of the value of free expression and academic freedom. And the reason I wrote about it is because I actually think, as much as there is a culture war going on, and there's hypocrites on both sides, the far right speaks a lot about free speech until they're getting criticized for the crap they're spewing, and they're hypocrites. But if we allow those voices to be silenced by university policy or by law, we are creating a culture, a systemic culture, where the value is weakened for everyone. And the example of that is Massimo Khan at Dalhousie University, a student who spoke out.
You should just take 30 seconds to remind everybody what that was about.
So this is a student who spoke out in a Facebook post, of all things, in expressing anti-colonial sentiment. She made a comment about white fragility, and another student took offense and thought she was being discriminatory against white people. And suddenly Dalhousie University is launching an investigation into her comments. And there are a number of voices who sprung up in her defense, but it's not people who speak out in defense of free speech generally. And notably, the alt-right characters it was crickets, right? No one else was coming to her defense. And so we're playing two sides, but what we do when we do that is we undermine the culture generally. And I think people who really want to push for progressive politics need to be very careful about this, because if they allow those values to be undermined for some people, it's eventually going to be determined by who's in power, and it'll affect them too.
Thomas, go ahead.
I wanted to come back to a point between the two panelists here. So one of the issues is how do we engage students, and how do we promote the discourse across that? And so one of the issues that we face in science is role models and a lack of role models. So try a poll, see if this works. I'm guessing that you all know what DNA is, right? So have you all heard of Watson and Crick? Right. What about Rosalind Franklin? Okay, so at least one knows. So Watson and Crick get the credit for the structure of DNA, but they were able to determine that structure based on Rosalind Franklin's data that was essentially stolen from her by her white supervisor. Right? And Watson is probably the highest profile scientist who, luckily, his profile is declining because he's a racist homophobe. But when you come into a classroom, right now, if you come into my classroom, the textbook that we use is Watson's Molecular Biology of the Gene, because it's the best textbook on this field. So I start the class by saying, I don't know if you're aware of this situation, but here is the backstory on Watson. And unfortunately, I don't have a better textbook to use, but that's the textbook that we've got. And so then I tell them the Franklin story when we go through the structure of DNA. The scientists that we value, the scientists that we put forward that students are looking at, I think influence who feels like they have a voice in the classroom. And so if I say to them, this discovery, the structure of DNA molecule was possible because of Rosalind Franklin's work, I think that puts a different voice in the classroom than if you ignore that.
Interesting.
I think we're sidestepping the issue. The issue is really one about the role the university has played in helping to produce the very kinds of oppressions that many of us teach and research right now. The university is deeply implicated in producing certain kinds of logics of white supremacy. And if we don't grapple with that, then we can't actually begin to grapple with the claims that people who have been consistently oppressed and shut out, now entering into the university, are making claims on that institution to better respond to them. This is what this is fundamentally about. But also, I would say to you, Steve, that what happens is, it's not from women's studies and black studies that these kinds of things emerge from. It's usually from white male scholars, by the majority, often making claims about things for which they have no expertise in. And then we find the entire institution coming into place to support their right to speech. It's fundamentally a problem.
Let's take your argument seriously and engage and say, if there are scholars in the university who have no expertise, as you claim, who are speaking and writing about things which they are not really qualified to speak about, it's precisely when there's free debate and academic freedom that kind of shoddy work is exposed. And that's where I want to agree with what it is.
The marketplace of free ideas has not consistently worked for non-white people. We should be honest about that.
Well, I think we're again, there's a confusion here. I think having, you call it marketplace, and I don't. I call it an agora, which is a different thing, but an open public square, not a marketplace, an open public square of free debate, not only for faculty members, where academic freedom has been, but for students. Students also have to feel free to say things that may be unpopular, may be unconventional, may be risky.
But not illegal.
No, of course not illegal, right?
200 years ago, we had marketplaces and agoras where people debated other people's humanity as well. Right now, what we do is in classrooms, we have people debating whether or not trans identities are viable identities.
But that's how universities evolve, and that's how they improve.
Exactly, and they evolve by also saying that some things are intolerable. What is the fear of saying that some forms of speech are intolerable in a world where we already have limits on speech? We've seen it happen in the university around BDS. We've seen it happen around Israeli apartheid. We've seen the university in many skillful kinds of ways limit speech.
Let me jump in here with this and get you to comment on it.
But they have.
Stand by, everybody. Here's Michael Coren has been on a bit of a journey over the last several years of his life. He wrote in the Toronto Star just the other day, "I wonder how young, vulnerable trans students are feeling right now. I've been sent numerous emails from trans kids and their supporters about the current situation that are heartbreaking, but I've not seen much coverage of this." Shannon, I wanted to ask you about some of the media coverage of this because I think it has overwhelmingly been, oh my goodness, look how our campuses have become paragons of political correctness and we have no more free expression and we're all going to hell in a handcart. What do you think's happening on the other side?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, I've been really concerned about the general effacement of discussion of trans and non-binary students in the media and public discussion about all of this. The reason that the Peterson video was contentious at all was because of the worry that it puts already vulnerable students in a more vulnerable position, right? Now we're kind of doubling down by leaving them out of the discussion and treating them as kind of fungible. Like really, it's all about free speech. It doesn't matter who the persons are who are involved.
But let me go back to Janice's original point, which is to say, are you denying those students an opportunity to develop resiliency skills by, as some would say, infantilizing them?
Trans students are more resilient than anyone you have ever met because they have dealt with a lifetime of oppression and stigma. This notion that they need to be introduced to Jordan Peterson's views in a classroom so that they know what the world is like out there is so ridiculously naive.
That's not the argument. That's actually not the argument that
the argument that the TA is making.
Yeah, but that's actually not the argument. Certainly trans students have a great deal of experience, too much, with those kinds of arguments and have heard them. The argument is that Jordan Peterson, whatever you think of his expertise, he is a faculty member who has the right to academic freedom, and that trans students are capable of dealing with that argument in a sophisticated way. And so it's actually, to me, that's the core of the argument, as you just said. They're stronger than we think, and therefore it is possible to have a debate as long as they're in the room, they have the opportunity to speak, and everybody recognizes that.
You come back on this, and then I'm going to throw to a clip.
I just want to notice, again, that one of the things that keeps coming up is this notion of the importance of debate. A debate is just one means of learning. It's just one means of communicating ideas, and it's a pretty agonistic approach as well. When we're dealing with ideas relating to people's historical and current lived oppressions, it seems to me that there are a lot of other communicative and pedagogical mechanisms available to us besides debates that don't then set up a polarization and tend to oversimplify.
Okay, let me jump in.
It must be clear that it's morally and ethically bankrupt, to put this in as harsh terms as I can, to debate other people's humanity. If we can't begin there, then there's something fundamentally wrong with the university as an institution.
Let me jump in here because this became an issue on the floor of the House of Commons not too long ago. The Leader of the Opposition asked the Prime Minister a question about this. He punted it to his Science Minister, and here's how the exchange went. Roll it.
Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister join me in condemning the egregious crackdown on free speech at Laurier University?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
The Minister of Science.
Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to creating open spaces for Canadians to debate and express their views. In a free society, we may disagree with the person's views, but we must defend their right to hold them, unless those views promote hate. Intolerance and hate have no place in Canadian society or in our post-secondary institutions. We will continue to fight to ensure the charter rights of Canadians are upheld and that every Canadian can feel safe and secure in their community.
Emmett, I'd like to know if you know what the minister's position is on this issue.
No idea. I'm concerned to see it become a bit of a partisan cudgel, right? So there were Liberal members raising questions about a talk or a debate about abortion at a Catholic university that had been shut down, and Conservative members throwing about this, and it's the same hypocrisy I was speaking about earlier, right? So we value speech based on the content, not based on the principle, and I think that's a big problem. I do want to go back a little bit to something Ronaldo was saying earlier. I don't think it is all useful, appropriate. I would agree. It would be morally bankrupt to conduct a debate in class about a particular group's humanity. But I don't think that's necessarily the sum total of everything that emanates out of Jordan Peterson and the issues he raises, no matter how odious we may view them. I think, like any rights debate, we are talking about what should the role of the law or public policy be in defining limits about what people can say about other people. What role should the state have in discrimination? Where do we draw the line? These are debates that apply in pretty much any rights category, and they apply to discrimination against people on the basis of their sexual identity or their gender identity.
This, however, Thomas, seemed to be one of the confusing aspects of the situation at Laurier, insofar as one of the professors who was upbraiding the teaching assistant for the way she conducted the class didn't seem to understand what the Canadian Human Rights Code prevented or didn't prevent, covered or didn't cover. Do you wonder whether faculty need a bit of a refresher on what's legal or illegal in their classrooms?
Almost certainly, but I don't know how I could tell you that we could do that in an effective way. And if I could just back up a point. So a point that I think you made really well is this idea of how we value ideas. And if I can go back to a point, Ronaldo, that you made, I think that fundamentally we value ideas, unfortunately, by who makes them more often than what the content of the idea is. And so the challenge is, how do we get a greater diversity of people actually having their voices heard? And that's the real question. You know, the specifics of this incident or these series of incidents aside, how do we get more people being heard, and so that we've got that diversity there? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's the fundamental question.
Well,
just to weigh in for 1 second on the question you asked, Ahmed, I don't know about the rest of you, but I have graduate students, and I'm sure you do. I found that the role that faculty played in that meeting toward their own graduate student was really surprising. We have an obligation to our graduate students, all of us, to educate, to be supportive, to help them learn. And the adversarial tone in that meeting, now we only know about it because it was a recording.
She taped it.
Yeah, which there's a whole set of ethical issues around that. But nevertheless, stunning to me as a faculty member, leave aside all other issues, that this was his graduate student, and there was this quality of tone to a graduate student, which frankly, talk about, was not what any of us would describe as a supportive learning environment.
I think that two purposes got conflated in one meeting in a really unhelpful way. We talked about this a little bit in the green room. On the one hand, all Ontario universities recently had to create new sexual violence policies and hire sexual violence coordinators, and because of an Ontario legislation, Bill 132, and we were forced to move very quickly, and so this was the kind of first real test of that quickly written and quickly written policy and the quickly built office at Laurier. But according to the Laurier policy, once a complaint is made, that office has to get involved. But another thing that was happening in the same meeting was academic supervisors of the graduate student offering feedback on the student's pedagogy. I happen to think the pedagogy was bad. I don't think that I wouldn't rule out ever showing that video in a classroom, but I think that given the intended learning outcomes for that class, it was bad pedagogy. But I think that it muddies the waters too much to bring in a pseudo-disciplinary discussion about sexual violence policy with a staff member at the same time as academic supervisors discuss pedagogy.
Bad conflation of two things.
Two meetings would have made it better.
Ronaldo.
Let's say his name, Professor Rambakuchen, found himself in a very difficult situation. He's also an untenured man of color. And we know, I've been a professor for over 2 decades. I know that as a young, untenured black professor, when I had white TAs, they often felt that they could do the course better than I could too. And they often overstretched their own responsibilities as TAs. I am sure that in the context of this one particular incident, that there's much more surrounding that professor's own experience with this young white woman. That shared race disempowerment speaks to these longer, deeper histories, again, that the best academic and scholarly work in women's studies, black studies, and other, what I'm going to have to use this term, all disciplines have been raised in, which is that, we see that kind of response when it's a young white woman. We see that kind of response when it's a white woman. Cher did not raise Khan in Parliament, right? And it's not just about hypocrisy. It's about a long, embedded history of who matters, who counts. This is about a culture war where representative democracies have had to yield more space to people who've been normally shut out. And as we come into these institutions and we ask for their transformation, things are beginning to fray. The university, as it looked in the 60s, it looks different now, and 20 years from now, it's going to look different.
Different again.
And we should be prepared for it.
I think that the Khan case is an example where the same principles apply as they do to Lindsay Shepherd. Whatever, you can disagree with her, you can say that her language was uncivil, as some of the stuff that Lindsay Shepherd showed in class. And civility is actually not a legal obligation, but it certainly is an important way that we enable people to get into a debate. But if for anybody not to defend her, who would defend Shepherd is, as you say, absolutely hypocritical. For me, they're exactly equivalent.
And they're both core. One was a Facebook post and one was a tutorial. Those have different purposes. Right?
No, but I'm saying the same standards apply, and there should not have
one
been.
Involves academic freedom and one involves freedom of expression. They're different kinds of freedoms.
There should not have been an investigation of a student who make that kind of comment. There could be all kinds of debate inside the university about whether it's civil, whether it's not. But there should not have been an official process launched. And that's why I don't
From
want...
From a Khan?
Right. And I don't, that's why I'm not comfortable.
The process of the university allows for the kinds of positions that a Peterson or a Shepard hold to take precedence.
Well, hang on. She said she didn't hold that position. For the record, she said she did not hold the position. I said that a Peterson or a Shepard. I'm not talking about her necessarily holding the position that he holds, but previous to the event, it's very clear what position she holds. But what I'm saying is using them as examples. The university itself, in its normative practices, allow those kinds of positions to have credence. And those are the kinds of positions that are often given weight and freight within the logic of the white supremacist university as we know it today. Emmett, can I understand from you, do you think all of what we've been discussing here is a genuine fear that maybe your students actually experience, or is this something that sort of is superimposed from the outside world and you happen to be the cauldron where it's all happening right now?
I mean, I don't want to overstate it as a phenomenon generally, right? Like, I think 2017 had some troubling cases that concern me, and they extend beyond the two we've been talking about to include canceled events, to Andrew Potter being resigned from the director of the McGill Institute.
Being resigned is not
let's be clear. No. But I actually think 99.9% of the time, everything runs really smoothly. We tend to, I think this is as much a problem of administration as it is anything emanating from the students. This is not, in my experience, profs are far more whiny than students are. So I really don't want, I really do push back against this kind of, well, 21st century university students are snowflakes kind of attitude. I really don't think that's the problem at all. I think when there are complaints, to answer your question, I think they're genuine. I think there might be cases sometimes where a student needs, rather than an investigation launch, the student needs to be explained to what the purpose of a university is and why what they are offended by is not necessarily something that the university is in a position to take action against. But where there are cases, I would hope that faculty members running classes are sensitive to precisely the sort of issues we're talking about. And as someone who, again, delves into these issues in literally every class I teach, I've probably taught about 3,000 students over 10 years of university teaching. I'm not aware of any complaint, either to me or to someone above me, regarding something that's been said in any of my classes.
So it is rare. I mean, Michael Corrin made the same point in his piece the other day. He's on campus now at U of T, and he says students feel comfortable engaging in different discussions.
They're high profile and rare.
High profile.
Worry about the Ed Shear quote, right? Ed Shear talked about a crackdown on Andrew Shear. A crackdown on free speech. We've got one anecdote. That's not a crackdown. That's an intentional hyperbolic move for political purposes.
But does this?
But it demonstrates the crisis in whiteness. That's why he's doing it. Much of this is about the crisis of whiteness taking place in the context of the university.
What's the crisis of whiteness?
The crisis of whiteness is that white people are no longer allowed to simply say and behave in ways that they could, for instance, in the 50s in the context of the university. We now push back on it. We now call it illegitimate. We now call it intolerable. We ask for better behavior, better practices, better policies.
Don't most university students know that now?
But actually, we keep talking about university students like if they're empty vessels. Those same students bring politics too. They bring their own political positions too, right? So when I'm teaching a class, I'm not teaching a bunch of empty vessels who don't hold political views about the material that we might be engaging with.
We're down to our last minute, and I want you to follow up on that, because I would have assumed any millennial who's in a university now knows the proper way to behave on these issues.
Okay,
you say no?
Yeah, I mean, do they know the proper way to behave? Yes. Do they understand the issues that are out there? No. And I think the best thing that we can do for students, no matter who the student is put that issue out there in their face and make them think about it and have them confront their position largely of privilege and power. I mean, even if you've got,
the best thing we can do is make students understand that rights are complex, that this country is built on balancing rights. If we have freedom of religion and women's rights, we've had a long discussion in this country about what we do with certain religious practices that systemically discriminate against women. So we are in a constant conversation about balancing rights. It's complex, it's hard work, it evolves over time, and we need an environment which allows people to say things that challenge conventional wisdom.
And Janice, we also live in a state and a country that continues to engage in forms of state discrimination, right? Carding is still real across this country and so on. So these questions are not simply questions that are neutral. These are not simply questions of we all come to.
Them?
Of course, but this is not a
one
question
thing
of
I can't challenge?
What I'm challenging is that this is not just about students.
I can't challenge the clock because it's run out. I want to thank all of you for what has been an absolutely splendid debate about a subject that may be rare, but is fascinating as hell and important. Kudos to all.
Universities are important to our society.
Indeed. And kudos to all of you for coming into TVO tonight and having this conversation with us. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.